Auctioneer laughed. Even the brothel rejected her, but a sheriff took her hand and said, "I'll buy." Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Dry Lantern's auction yard carried the kind of silence that came from people waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Dust moved slowly between the boards of the rough wooden fence, settling on coats, boots, and the uneven ground where countless trades had taken place over the years. The place smelled of horses, sweat, and old wood. Men leaned against posts with the dull interest of those who had seen too much and learned not to care unless it benefited them. Richard Hale stood alone near the far corner of the yard, holding his weight evenly on both feet, his hands tucked lightly into his coat pockets. He was 38, a sheriff by badge, but a quiet man by nature, shaped by years of trying to keep violence from swallowing the edges of this small border town. He had come because the marshal sent word about a dispute near the auction platform, and Richard made a habit of checking trouble before it grew. His main goal was simple: stop cruelty early, handle conflict without gunfire, and keep the town from turning into the kind of place he'd once escaped. He scanned the crowd with steady eyes. He recognized ranch hands, drifters, gamblers, and a few men who treated the auction like entertainment. His jaw tightened when he saw the auctioneer dragging out a thin woman with torn sleeves and dust-coated boots. The woman didn't resist. She moved in short steps, careful not to stumble. Her name, he overheard, was Mara Lee. She looked around 27. Her past had begun to spread in whispers. Sold twice. Worked in places that had drained the life out of her. Pushed from town to town by people who only saw her as a burden. Mara kept her head down as she reached the platform. Her breathing stayed tight, her hands clasped together in a way that suggested she was trying to keep herself from shaking. She told herself to stay upright. She told herself to avoid eye contact. Years of surviving harsh treatment had trained her to recognize danger in posture, eyes, movements, and tone. The crowd's murmur already warned her what would come next. The auctioneer lifted her chin roughly. She didn't fight him. She braced for whatever came, because resisting had only made things worse in every place she had been before. She watched the ground behind his boots, counting the seconds until the next insult landed. This one couldn't even get work at the brothel, the auctioneer announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. They said she wasn't worth the trouble. The men closest to the platform laughed, but the laughter lacked real spirit. It held boredom more than cruelty, which made the scene feel even colder. Mara's throat tightened, but she kept her expression controlled. She had heard worse. She had seen worse. Her goal today was survival. Endure the moment, hope someone kinder than the last owner stepped forward, and pray the blows didn't start in front of all these people. Richard felt a slow pressure in his chest. He didn't know Mara, but he understood the look she had in her eyes. The guarded weight of someone who expected pain as routine. He had seen that look before, during the worst parts of his job. He had also carried his own version of it years ago, when he survived a ranch ambush that left half his crew dead. He rarely spoke about it, but the memory guided his choices every time he walked into a scene where someone was cornered. The auctioneer shoved Mara forward slightly. "Anyone? She's light work. Eats little. Doesn't talk much." Mara kept still. Her breathing quickened for a single second. She hated being spoken about like livestock, but she didn't allow her expression to change. Feeling anything in public had always brought punishment. Richard stepped forward without thinking. His boots hit the dirt with a firm sound that cut through the muttering crowd. He didn't shout. He didn't pause to consider the consequences. "I'll buy," he said. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. "You sure, Sheriff?" "She ain't." "I said I'll buy," Richard repeated, calm but unwavering. Mara lifted her eyes a fraction, startled by the tone. She didn't see pity. She saw a man who made decisions without cruelty behind them. Richard reached into his coat and counted the necessary coins. He handed them directly to the auctioneer, who quickly pocketed them and stepped back. Richard then removed his coat and held it toward Mara. She stared at the coat for a moment, unsure how to react. No man had ever offered her anything without expecting something in return. She waited for the catch, the smirk, the condition. None came. Richard stood steady, giving her the choice. Her hands trembled as she reached for the coat. When her fingers brushed his, she felt how warm his skin was compared to the cold that had settled into her bones. She wrapped the coat around herself, pressing the fabric against her arms. Richard didn't speak again. He didn't touch her beyond that brief moment. He simply stepped aside and nodded toward the exit. Mara hesitated. Her thoughts raced. If I follow him, what will he want? If I stay here, what will they do? Which path offers survival? Which path offers less pain? She looked at the crowd, uninterested, impatient, indifferent. Then she looked at Richard, who had already turned slightly toward the road without trying to force her decision. She stepped toward him. They walked out together, side by side, but separated by a respectful distance. The crowd slowly returned to its idle chatter. No one followed them. Outside the yard, the wind carried a cleaner scent. Mara inhaled cautiously, as though unsure if she was allowed to breathe deeply. Richard led her to his horse, a steady brown gelding tied to a post. He rested his hand on the saddle, but didn't reach for her. "You can ride," he said. "I'll walk." Mara analyzed the situation quickly. Letting a man stand beside a mounted woman was unusual, but not threatening. He wasn't positioning himself to control her. He was giving her height and time. She placed one hand on the saddle horn, tested her balance, and climbed up with slow precision. Richard loosened the reins and began walking. His steps were even and quiet. He kept his attention on the road ahead, not on her. Mara watched him closely. His silence didn't feel manipulative. It felt careful, controlled. She noted how he didn't glance back to check if she feared falling. He didn't comment on her posture. He didn't treat her like property. She adjusted the coat tighter around her shoulders. For the first time all day, her breathing eased without force. Richard guided them toward the outskirts of town, where his cabin stood on a small rise surrounded by low fields. As they moved, the tension in Mara's chest shifted, still present, still sharp, but no longer suffocating. She didn't trust him yet. Trust took time, but she sensed he wouldn't strike her for moving too slowly or speaking out of turn. Richard, walking beside the horse, wondered quietly what came next. He had acted out of instinct, but now he felt a responsibility settle onto him. His main mission had always been preventing harm. Today, harm had been avoided, but the real work had just begun. Behind them, the auction yard faded into distance. Ahead of them, the cabin waited, quiet, worn, and ready to test whether two damaged lives could exist under one roof without collapsing. Richard led the gelding up the narrow rise where his cabin sat, the structure framed by scattered grass and a few stubborn shrubs clinging to the early winter cold. The sun had begun to sink behind the ridge, turning the land into long stretches of muted color. Mara sat rigidly in the saddle, watching every shift in the landscape as if danger might come from behind a fence post or the curve of the hill. She kept one hand on the saddle horn, her fingers pressed tight, not wanting him to notice how hard she fought to stay steady. When they reached the porch, Richard held the reins loosely and waited for her to climb down on her own terms. She placed her foot carefully on the stirrup, testing the distance before lowering herself to the ground. Her knees wobbled from exhaustion, but she managed to keep her balance. Richard stood a few steps away, giving her the space she needed to regain control of her breathing. The cabin door creaked when he pushed it open. The room inside was small but orderly, warmed by a stove that still held the heat from the morning fire. A wooden table stood near the window, with two chairs placed at an angle that suggested he rarely hosted anyone. Mara paused in the doorway, scanning the interior as if memorizing each object. The tin plates stacked on a shelf, the folded blanket on the bed, the boots placed neatly beside the wall. She tried to determine if anything in the room hinted at unpredictability. Nothing did. "You can sit if you want," Richard said, keeping his tone even. He removed his hat and set on a nail hammered into the wall. He didn't reach for her coat, even though it belonged to him. Mara moved into the cabin with the careful steps of someone who had entered too many rooms where safety depended on choosing the right corner. She lowered herself onto the edge of the chair closest to the door, ready to move quickly if needed. The coat slipped from her shoulder, but she pulled it close again, unwilling to lose the protective weight of it. Richard carried a jug of water to the table and poured a cup without asking whether she wanted any. He placed it within her reach and stepped away before she touched it. She lifted the cup, testing the temperature. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but because her body had not yet adjusted to the idea that she was no longer being watched by men who wanted something from her. He moved to the stove, adding a few pieces of wood. The dull thud of the logs settling filled the space between them. Mara watched his movements, trying to understand him. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, wasn't showing any expectation. He simply worked with quiet efficiency, the way someone did when they were used to keeping their thoughts contained. Richard stood beside the stove for a moment before speaking again. "There's food if you're hungry." Her throat tightened. Hunger had been a constant companion for years, but asking for food had often brought punishment. She nodded instead of speaking. He pulled a small pot from the shelf, ladled some stew into a bowl, and set it in front of her. She waited for him to sit first. When he didn't, she took the first bite slowly, ready to stop if he objected. He didn't move toward her. He didn't comment on the pace at which she ate. He just watched the fire, arms folded, giving her the space to eat without pressure. As she finished the meal, she noticed something unexpected. He kept his distance not out of disinterest, but out of respect. She felt a small shift inside her, a quiet relief she hadn't planned on feeling. She wasn't ready to trust him, yet she no longer feared an immediate blow or demand. Richard finally turned toward her. "The bed's yours tonight. I'll take the floor." Her brows tightened slightly. "You don't have to," she said, barely audible. "It's fine," he answered. "You need rest more than I do." She glanced at the bed, unsure if she should accept. Her legs ached from walking, riding, and weeks of restless nights. She gave a single nod. Richard retrieved a thin blanket from the shelf and rolled it out on the floor beside the stove. He lay down without removing his coat, as if he wanted to keep some part of himself guarded. Mara rose from the chair with slow, cautious movements. She sat on the edge of the bed first, testing its firmness. When she stretched out, she kept her boots on, unwilling to be fully vulnerable in a stranger's home. She pulled the coat closer to her chest, sealing in the leftover warmth from his body. The cabin grew quiet. The only sound came from the steady crackle of the fire. Richard lay with his eyes open, listening to her breathing become more even. He knew she wasn't asleep. People who lived on edge never drifted easily. He didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't do anything that might unsettle her. Mara stared at the ceiling boards, counting each small knot in the wood. Her thoughts moved quickly. Why'd he buy me? What does he expect? How long until he shows his real intentions? But another thought pressed through the noise. He had not touched her since giving her the coat. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a single threat. That alone felt unfamiliar. Richard adjusted his position slightly, careful not to make noise. He thought about the auction yard, the way she stood like someone waiting for unseen blows. Something about her had reached a place in him he preferred to keep buried, his instinct to protect those who had no reason to trust anyone. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing clearly. She wasn't going back to that platform. After several minutes of silence, Mara spoke for the first time since entering the cabin. "Why did you help me?" Richard stared at the dark ceiling, choosing his words. "Because no one else did." Her breath caught for a moment. The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't designed to impress. It was simple, and that made it harder for her to dismiss. She turned her face slightly toward him, but didn't ask anything else. She wasn't ready. He respected that. The firelight flickered across the room, settling over both of them, one on the bed, one on the floor, each holding their own history of wounds and uncertainty. Neither slept fully that night, but neither felt the familiar fear that usually filled the quiet hours. For the first time in a long while, Mara allowed her body to relax, just enough to feel the softness beneath her. Richard listened to the wind press against the walls and thought, without saying it aloud, that bringing her here had been the only choice he could live with. The cabin held them both in a fragile, unfamiliar calm as the night deepened. Morning arrived quietly, without the sharp light that usually cut across the plains. Instead, a pale, muted glow seeped through the single window of Richard's cabin, settling over the floor in a thin band. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only a faint warmth near the stove. Richard rose first, careful not to shift his blanket too loudly. His back ached from sleeping on the hardboards, but he didn't let the discomfort show. He sat upright, adjusting his boots with slow, controlled movements. Mara lay on the bed, fully clothed, her knees slightly bent, her fingers curled around the coat he had given her. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as she realized the day had begun. She pushed herself up, keeping her posture guarded, not wanting to appear vulnerable. Richard stood and began rebuilding the fire with practiced ease. He added small pieces of kindling, then a larger log. The crackle of the flame drew Mara's attention immediately. She watched the rising heat with a mixture of relief and wariness, grateful for the warmth but alert to every sound in the room. "You can wash up if you want," Richard said, nodding toward the small basin against the far wall. His voice was calm, neither distant nor overly familiar. Mara hesitated before sliding off the bed. Her boots hit the floor with a soft thud. She approached the basin as someone would approach uncertain ground, testing each step. She dipped her hands into the cool water and wiped her face, trying to remove the dust and sweat that had clung to her since yesterday. She avoided looking at Richard while she did it. Old habits warned her that eye contact could invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. Richard busied himself near the pantry shelves, gathering a small portion of beans and a strip of dried meat for breakfast. He worked with the focus of a man who needed routine to steady himself. His movements were consistent and purposeful, revealing a background shaped by discipline. Years ago, before taking the badge, he had worked long days as a ranch foreman, organizing crews, inspecting fence lines, and dealing with rough men who respected strength more than authority. Those experiences had carved a quiet restraint into him, a habit of acting rather than speaking. Mara finished washing and stood still, unsure where to sit. Richard noticed the hesitation and stepped aside from the stove. "You can take the chair," he said, motioning gently. She moved toward it and sat, keeping her hands in her lap. Her breathing stayed controlled. She didn't know what to expect from him yet, but she noted that he always spoke plainly, without demands or sharp undertones. Richard placed a cup of water in front of her, then sat across from her with a plate of food between them. He wasn't a man who lingered on meals, but he ate slowly today, partly to match her pace, partly to give her a chance to feel the space between them. Mara took small bites, watching him over the edge of the cup. She observed how he held himself, his shoulders firm, his gaze lowered when he sensed she was studying him, his hands steady as he cut the meat with a worn knife. He looked like someone accustomed to solitude. She wondered how long he had lived this way, and whether bringing her here had disrupted a rhythm he depended on. When they finished eating, Richard stood and gathered the dishes. Mara reached for one of the plates before he could take it from the table. He paused, surprised by the small gesture. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice low but steady. She carried the plate to the basin and washed it carefully, making sure not to spill a drop. Her body was still tense, but the act of doing something useful gave her a sense of grounding she hadn't felt in months. Richard watched her without intruding. He recognized the instinct. Many people who had lived under harsh conditions needed tasks to keep their thoughts manageable. After the dishes were cleaned, Mara stepped back from the basin and looked around the cabin in a way she hadn't allowed herself to the night before. She noticed the small details now, the way the knife marks cut into the wooden table, the patched section of the bed frame, the thin line of dust on the windowsill. The cabin was quiet but lived in, cared for by someone who preferred simplicity over comfort. Richard retrieved his coat and slipped it on. "I'm heading out to check the livestock. You can stay inside and rest. Door latch works from the inside." Mara stared at the latch. The idea of being able to lock a door for safety felt foreign. Most places she had lived didn't allow her that choice. She approached it slowly and tested the mechanism. It clicked firmly, a clean sound that surprised her. Richard waited at the threshold. "I'll be in the yard if you need anything." She nodded once. His footsteps moved across the porch, then faded into the early morning stillness. When he was gone, Mara stood in the center of the room, trying to understand the flood of unfamiliar sensations. She felt exposed but not endangered. She felt tired but not terrified. She felt the weight of the coat around her shoulders and realized she had not been cold since entering the cabin. She walked to the window and looked outside. Richard checked the horse's hooves, inspected the fence posts, and moved with the calm precision of a man who relied on order to keep his world intact. She watched him work, noting that he didn't glance back to make sure she was still inside. He gave her privacy without stating it. That alone unsettled her more than any threat would have. Choice was harder to accept than commands. Mara stepped away from the window and touched the table lightly, as if confirming it was solid. She had been treated as property for so long that being placed in a quiet, safe room felt almost dangerous. Her mind kept waiting for the trap, the condition, the shift in tone. But nothing happened. Richard continued working outside, unaware that every movement he made was being studied by a woman who had learned to measure people in seconds. Inside the cabin, Mara took a deep breath, the first one that didn't claw at her chest since she arrived. She didn't trust this place yet. She didn't trust him either. But for the first time in years, she wasn't preparing for immediate pain. It was a strange beginning, unsteady, cautious, and fragile, but it was real. The sun rose higher by mid-morning, casting a cleaner light across the yard than the previous day's muted dawn. Mara remained near the window, standing still as she watched Richard carry a feed bucket toward the small enclosure behind the cabin. His movements were efficient and calm, the kind of motions that came from years of repeating the same tasks until they became muscle memory. He seemed most at ease when his hands were occupied. She studied him carefully, not out of distrust alone, but because she needed to understand the man who had altered the direction of her life in a single sentence. He lifted the gate latch, scattered the feed with a steady swing of his arm, and spoke softly to the gelding in a tone she hadn't expected, a tone without command or impatience. The horse nudged his shoulder, and Richard led it, his posture loosening for the first time since she had met him. Mara exhaled slowly. That simple interaction revealed more about him than anything else he had done. She learned he knew how to handle living beings without force. She learned he didn't raise his voice to assert control. She learned he valued the things he cared for, even if he didn't show it openly. When Richard finished outside, he wiped his hands on his trouser leg and approached the cabin. Mara stepped back instinctively, not wanting him to think she had been staring. He entered without comment, set a small sack of potatoes on the table, and looked around the room as if assessing what still needed doing. "I'll fix the porch rail after lunch," he said, keeping his voice level. "Wind knocked it loose last week." Mara nodded, unsure if he expected a response. She reached for the sack cautiously and began sorting through the potatoes. She wasn't sure why she did it. Perhaps routine made her feel useful, or perhaps she wanted to show she wasn't helpless. Her hands moved slowly at first, then more naturally as she fell into the rhythm of checking for soft spots and placing the good ones in a neat line. Richard watched for a brief moment before heading to a shelf near the wall. He retrieved a hammer and set it beside the door. Mara tracked the motion, expecting a raised voice or an instruction. Neither came. Her pulse steadied. He filled a pot with water and placed it on the stove. She stepped aside so he could pass, and the slight brush of air between them made her tense for a heartbeat. But Richard didn't crowd her or block her path. He simply worked around her like she was another part of the cabin, present, valued, not owned. As the water warmed, Mara quietly gathered the potatoes she had sorted and placed them in a bowl. The simple action grounded her. She wasn't being ordered to do anything. She wasn't being punished for acting independently. She could choose how to help, and he allowed it. Richard stirred the pot, then glanced toward her. "You cook." Her throat tightened. The question wasn't demanding. It wasn't laced with expectation. It was a plain inquiry, spoken as if he was trying to understand her skill set rather than dictate tasks. "Yes," she said softly. "I've cooked in different places. It depended on where I ended up." "That's good," he replied. If you want to handle the cooking sometimes, that's fine with me. If not, I'll do it. Mara blinked. Choice again. Unfamiliar, disorienting. She nodded, unsure how to respond verbally without revealing how strange the offer felt. Richard stepped outside to gather nails for the porch rail. While he worked, Mara moved through the cabin slowly and deliberately. She folded the blanket on the bed, brushed dust off the table with her hand, and tightened the rope around the bundle of kindling near the stove. She wasn't used to organizing a home without fear of making a mistake. She checked the door twice before touching anything else, as if reminding herself she could secure it whenever she needed. By midday, she stirred the pot of soup on the stove, adjusting the flames carefully. The smell of cooking vegetables filled the cabin, giving it a warmer, more lived-in feeling. When Richard returned, carrying a few planks of wood under his arm, the scent caught him off guard. He paused at the doorway, almost unsure if he had stepped into the wrong cabin. Mara straightened her back, prepared to be criticized. Instead, Richard nodded once. Smells decent. The simple acknowledgement made her shoulders relax unexpectedly. She turned off the flame and ladled the soup into 2 bowls. They ate in quiet. Not tense quiet, steady quiet. Richard's presence across the table felt grounded, not looming. He ate without rushing. Mara watched the way he held the spoon, controlled and measured, as if he didn't want to startle her with sudden movement. After the meal, Richard stood and carried both bowls to the basin. He washed them without asking her to help. She noticed his habit of rinsing each item twice, wiping them with a cloth that had been folded neatly on a hook. He took care of his belongings, and now he was extending that same respect to the shared space. When he stepped outside to repair the porch, Mara followed with the hammer he had forgotten on the table. She kept her distance, but wanted to return it. She set the hammer near his tools and stepped back before he could thank her. He crouched beside the loose rail, hammering the nails in with steady, even strikes. Mara stood on the porch, watching how he measured each angle before committing to the next movement. She realized something new. He wasn't only quiet. He was methodical, intentional, shaped by a life where mistakes carried heavy consequences. The afternoon wind shifted, tugging strands of her hair across her face. She brushed them back, noticing that her hands no longer shook as violently as they had the day before. Richard looked up briefly. "You cold?" "No," she said. "The coat helps." He nodded and returned to the rail. She lingered a few more moments, breathing in the thin, clean air. She could still feel the ghosts of yesterday, the crowd, the auctioneer's laugh, the sense of being displayed like damaged goods. But the memory felt slightly further away now. The cabin, the work, the quiet steadiness of this man. They pushed back against the weight of her past. By the time he finished repairing the rail, the sun had lowered behind the hills. Richard stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and surveyed the cabin with a look that wasn't pride, but something close to satisfaction. Mara watched him, unsure how to name the feeling growing inside her. It wasn't trust, not fully. It wasn't comfort either. It was the first fragile hint that she wasn't simply passing time here. She was beginning to exist in a space where her presence didn't provoke harm. "Tomorrow," Richard said, gathering his tools, "I'll show you where I keep the storage supplies. Just so you know your way around." Mara nodded softly. "All right." Inside the cabin, the fire waited. The night would bring its own challenges, restlessness, memories, guarded silence. But the day had been different. For both of them. The next morning broke clearer than the last, with sharper sunlight slipping between thin clouds and stretching across the dry grass behind the cabin. A faint chill clung to the air, not harsh enough to sting, but cold enough to remind anyone outside that winter was approaching steadily. Richard stepped out first, carrying a small bucket toward the well. His boots pressed firm tracks into the ground, forming a steady pattern that seemed to match the silent rhythm of his thoughts. Inside, Mara pulled the coat tighter around herself as she watched him from the window. The way he moved, quiet, direct, never rushed, continued to unsettle her in ways she couldn't explain. Men in her past had always acted abruptly, using sudden movements as a way to keep control. Richard did the opposite. He telegraphed every action, leaving no room for fear to grow in the shadows between gestures. She stepped away from the window and began folding the blanket she had slept on, smoothing the creases carefully. A soft calm settled over her hands as she worked. The tasks she performed in this cabin didn't feel forced. They didn't feel monitored. They were just pieces of a morning that didn't require fear to remain in the room. Richard returned a few minutes later, carrying the bucket with an even stride. He set it beside the basin without glancing her way, giving her time to adjust to his presence. Mara stood near the table, unsure whether to speak. The silence between them felt less brittle than it had earlier in the week. It held room for choices. "I'll take the horse out for a short ride," Richard said as he removed his gloves. "Check the fence line on the north side. If you want, you can stay inside or come out and walk the yard. No one passes near here unless they're lost." Mara nodded. She appreciated the information, even if she wasn't ready to wander far from the safety of four walls. "I'll stay here," she said quietly. He gave a small nod, not pressing her to do more than she felt comfortable with. As he prepared the saddle outside, she moved toward the shelves to straighten the items he had left there, folding a cloth, organizing a stack of tin cups, placing a cracked jar in a position where it wouldn't fall. She didn't know why she wanted the space to look cared for. Maybe order made her feel steady. Maybe she wanted him to see she wasn't afraid of responsibility. Richard's footsteps returned faster than expected. Mara turned, confused, only to find him standing in the doorway, holding a small bundle of firewood. He had forgotten it on the porch earlier. He placed it near the stove, his expression unreadable, then headed back outside. Once he rode off, Mara opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The sunlight hit her face with a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the air settle over her skin. The land stretched wide and open around the cabin, offering a kind of quiet she didn't know how to interpret. Quiet usually meant danger approaching. Here, it meant nothing at all. She sat on the edge of the porch, hands resting on her knees. Her mind wandered to the auction yard, the faces, the laughter, the fear that had curled inside her when she was shoved forward. The memory tightened her stomach. She inhaled slowly, focusing on the cabin's stillness instead. She whispered to herself, although the sound barely carried, "You're not there anymore." Time passed without urgency. Birds moved through the scrub brush. A few leaves skittered across the ground. The breeze brushed against her coat with enough force to stir her hair, but not enough to send her back inside. Richard returned in the early afternoon, guiding the horse with an easy hand. Mara stood as he approached. He noticed immediately she was outside by choice. A small shift, but meaningful. "How's the fence?" she asked, surprising both of them. "Needs repair," he said. "I'll get to it later this week." She stepped aside so he could tie the reins. He loosened the saddle straps and lifted the gear from the horse's back, setting it across the fence rail. Mara watched his movements. He was tired. The ride hadn't been long, but his shoulders carried tension that had nothing to do with distance. She recognized the signs of a man holding something in, something he wouldn't show unless pushed. "You okay?" she asked before she could stop herself. Richard paused, then met her eyes briefly. "I'm fine," he said, though the weight in his voice told a deeper story. She didn't press. She knew too well what it looked like when someone tried to pry into wounds not yet ready to be uncovered. Instead, she walked to the woodpile and picked up 2 small logs. She carried them inside, keeping her steps measured. When Richard entered the cabin, she already had a pot of water warming. The room carried a faint smell of dried herb from a jar she had opened earlier. She didn't know if he liked the scent, but she wanted the place to feel less like a place people pass through and more like a place a person could stand still in. "You didn't need to start that," Richard said as he removed his coat. "I know," she answered. It helped pass the time. He accepted this with a nod and sat at the table, rubbing the back of his hand with his thumb. Mara noticed the scrapes near his knuckles, fresh marks likely from the fence line. She considered offering to clean the cuts, but stopped herself, unsure whether he would welcome the gesture. Instead, she sat across from him. The room felt different now, not because of anything physical, but because they were facing each other without the tension that usually clouded shared space. Earlier, Richard said, resting his elbows on the table, "You seemed more at ease." Mara looked down at her hands. "It felt quiet," she said. "Not the dangerous kind. Just quiet." He let the silence settle before answering. "That's how it usually is here. Nothing gets close unless it wants water or trouble. And trouble doesn't often wander this far." She absorbed his words with a mix of comfort and disbelief. Safety was a concept she was still learning to understand. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the unfamiliar weight of calm pressing against her nerves. It wasn't unwelcome. It was simply new. Richard stood and fetched 2 cups, pouring water into each. When he handed one to her, their fingers touched briefly. The contact startled her, not because it hurt, but because it didn't carry expectation. His skin was warm, steady, grounded. "Thank you," she murmured. "Sure," he replied. For a long moment, nothing moved except the slow drift of sunlight across the floor. Mara realized something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. This man didn't want anything from her. He wasn't waiting for her to fail. He wasn't watching her for weakness. He simply shared the space with her, as if that was enough. Her breathing eased. Richard's gaze softened, though he didn't smile. "You're doing all right," he said quietly. Her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name, something between relief and disbelief. "I'm trying," she whispered. "That's all you need to do," he answered. The rest of the day passed in steady movements. Him fixing a loose hinge on the door, her sweeping the floor to clear dust gathered along the walls. They worked separately, but with a strange sense of rhythm, as if unknowingly matching each other's pace. By evening, the cabin felt changed, not in its structure, but in the way it held them. 2 people who had spent years preparing for the worst were beginning, very slowly, to understand the possibility of something gentler. Neither said aloud, but both felt the shift. The next day began with a heavier sky. Low clouds drifted across the ridge, muting the light and dimming the land around the cabin. The air felt denser than before, thick enough that Mara noticed the weight of it when she stepped outside. She wrapped Richard's coat tightly around herself as she watched him chop wood near the edge of the yard. Each swing of the axe was controlled, deliberate, and steady. Richard wasn't a man who wasted energy. He split each log with a measured force that came from years of doing this exact task, morning after morning, alone. His breath left his chest in slow bursts, fogging faintly in the cool air. Mara observed him with growing curiosity. Every gesture he made seemed rooted in a past he didn't share, one shaped by discipline, long days on ranches, and responsibilities he had carried long before she appeared in his life. She wondered what kind of losses had turned him into someone so quiet, someone who relied on control rather than anger. She stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. "Do you want help?" she asked. He stopped mid-swing, resting the axe head against the stump. He looked at her carefully, weighing whether her offer came from obligation or choice. "You don't have to," he said. "But if you want to stack the split pieces, that's fine." Mara lowered herself beside the pile of wood and began organizing each piece into a neat column. Her hands worked steadily, adjusting to the weight and texture of the logs. She found the physical work strangely calming. It didn't require emotional endurance or social guessing, just movement and focus. While she stacked, Richard resumed chopping, careful not to let any chips of wood fly in her direction. The silence between them felt structured, purposeful. They were 2 people working in parallel lines that didn't collide. After a while, Richard set the axe aside and wiped his palms on his trousers. "That's enough for now," he said. "Storm's coming in later. We have time to prep before it hits." Mara straightened her back, brushing dirt from her sleeves. She followed him toward the cabin, noticing how the wind had picked up. The scent of cold weather carried through the air, warning anyone who paid attention that the temperature would drop quickly. Inside, Richard began sorting through supplies. He opened a small cabinet built into the wall, revealing jars of dried beans, flour, a tin of coffee, and a few bundles of herbs. Mara took a step toward the shelves and reached for one of the jars. "You keep everything organized," she said. "It makes winter easier," Richard replied. Knowing where things are helps when you're running low. His answer gave her a clearer picture of how he lived before her arrival. Structured days, minimal belongings, no one to speak to over meals. She wondered if he preferred solitude or simply accepted it because he had no other option. While they checked the supplies, Mara's thoughts drifted back to the auction yard. The memory pushed its way into her mind without warning. The shove, the laughter, the feeling of worthlessness pressing down on her chest. Her breathing tightened before she could stop it. Richard noticed instantly. "You all right?" he asked, his tone steady but alert. Mara hesitated. This was the question she hated most, because answering it honestly had never led to safety in her past. But Richard's gaze held no pressure, only concern shaped by patience. "I was thinking about yesterday," she said quietly, "and the days before that, and everything." He nodded, folding his arms loosely across his chest. "Memories don't leave quick." His voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't hard either. It carried the tone of someone who had learned the truth firsthand. "Takes time." Mara lowered her head. She wanted to ask why he bought her, truly bought her, when he gained nothing from it. The question had burned inside her since the moment she stepped off the auction platform. Finally, she spoke. "Why did you say those words?" "At the yard." Richard took a slow breath, his jaw tightening before he answered. "Because watching them treat you like that felt wrong. And walking away from wrong makes a man weak. I've done enough of that in my life." She watched him closely. That answer wasn't simple charity. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to conviction. A personal standard he refused to compromise anymore. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "No," he said immediately. "Not once." She absorbed the words, unsure how to hold them. No man had ever spoken about her fate without using her name as leverage. Richard's certainty unsettled her because it carried no hidden conditions. Mara turned toward the stove, placing her hands against the iron surface for warmth. The heat grounded her, but a new question rose in her chest, one she feared asking because of what the answer might reveal. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered. Richard stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. "Whatever you want," he said. "You're not owned. You're not held. You're free to choose what comes next." The word free hit her like a wave she couldn't brace for. She had not been free in years, not in decisions, not in movement, not in her body, not in her thoughts. The idea of freedom felt unstable, like standing on ground that might crack beneath her feet. She turned around with a sharp inhale. "I don't know how to decide anything," she admitted. Her voice trembled with frustration rather than fear. "People made every choice for me. Every day. For so long." Richard's eyes softened, something she hadn't seen before from him. "Then you start small," he said. "Choose the blanket you want on the bed. Decide whether you want coffee or water. Pick which side of the cabin you sleep on. The rest will come." Mara gripped the edge of the table for support. She wasn't crying, but her eyes held a shine she couldn't hide. No one had ever broken freedom into manageable pieces for her. Freedom had always been presented as a distant miracle, not a series of practical steps. Richard stepped back to give her room. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." Mara looked at the shelves, the bed, the stove, the window, the pieces of the cabin that suddenly felt less like a place she had been dropped into and more like a place she might shape bit by bit. She noticed something else too. Richard never positioned himself between her and the door. Not once. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but it carried more meaning than anything he had said. He wasn't keeping her in. He wasn't preventing her escape. He was letting her exist without guarding her movements. The realization struck deep. After a long moment, she answered him. I want to stay here. For now." Richard didn't smile, but his expression changed in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. His shoulders eased and the tension around his eyes faded. "All right," he said. "Then we'll figure out what comes next." Outside, the first signs of an approaching storm gathered. Wind shifting, branches bending, clouds stacking. Inside the cabin, something softer was forming. The early shape of trust, fragile but real. For the first time in years, Mara's future wasn't decided by force. She had chosen it herself. Wind thickened by late afternoon, as the storm Richard predicted began its slow approach from the western ridge. The sky darkened with heavy clouds that rolled low enough to mute the land, creating a deep stillness that made every sound sharper. Mara stood on the porch, watching the horizon tighten with a gray line of incoming weather. She held the coat close, its weight a steady reminder of the moment her life shifted direction. Richard returned from the shed, carrying a coil of rope and 2 lanterns. He moved with purpose, his expression focused as he prepared for the storm's arrival. Mara stepped aside so he could pass, noticing the slight limp in his left leg. He hadn't shown it before. Maybe the cold brought it out. She wondered if the injury came from ranch work or something less ordinary, but she didn't ask. She sensed he didn't share pieces of himself easily. "Storm will hit before sundown," he said as he placed the lanterns on the table. "We'll tie down anything loose outside and keep the fire strong tonight." Mara followed him back into the yard. As they moved around the cabin, she listened to the shifting wind, the creak of dry branches, and the distant rumble of air clashing above the hills. The unease she felt wasn't fear of weather. It was the tension of sharing uncertain moments with someone whose reactions she was still learning. Richard handed her one end of the rope. "Help me with this. Wrap it around the barrel and pull tight." She nodded, stepping toward the rain barrel. The rope scratched her palms, but she pulled hard, securing the ties as he worked the opposite side. Their movements lined up naturally, not practiced but compatible. Richard noticed her determination and the way she didn't hesitate when faced with physical tasks. She wasn't fragile. She was worn, wary, and still learning her strength, but not fragile. "You've done this before," he said, testing the knot she tied. "Not with storms," she replied, "but I've had to keep things from blowing away." She didn't explain further, and he didn't press for details. Her voice had tightened with memory, and he recognized when silence was safer. When everything outside was secured, they stepped back into the cabin. Richard closed the shutters firmly and checked the window frames for drafts. Mara added more wood to the stove, watching the flames rise with steady interest. The warmth brightened the room, pushing back the dark corners that always made her uneasy. Richard removed his coat and hung it near the door. Mara looked at him, surprised by the softness in his expression. He wasn't smiling, but something had shifted in the way he looked at her, less guarded, less distant. "You all right?" he asked, adjusting the lantern wick. "Yes," she said. "This storm, it feels different. I'm not scared of it." "That's good." Mara sat at the table while Richard trimmed the wick on the second lantern. The light cast shadows across his face, revealing lines near his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Marks carved by years of grief, worry, and nights spent awake more often than asleep. She studied him a moment longer, then asked a question that had lingered in her thoughts since morning. "Do you live like this every winter? Alone, I mean." Richard rested the trimmer on the table. "I've been on my own a long time. People keep their distance when they don't know what to do with someone quiet." "Quiet isn't a problem," Mara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her tone. "It can be," he replied. "But most of the time, it's easier than talking." Mara understood that too well. Silence had been her shield for years, her way of avoiding punishment, her method of disappearing into the background. But silence in this cabin didn't feel like fear. It felt like space to breathe. A sudden gust hit the side of the house, shaking the shutters. Mara flinched, instinctive and sharp. Richard noticed immediately and stepped closer, his voice steady. "It's just wind. Cabins held through worse." She nodded, but her pulse raced. She didn't like sudden noise. Sudden noise usually meant incoming danger. He didn't touch her. He didn't crowd her. He simply stood near enough that she didn't feel alone with the fear. After a long moment, her shoulders eased. The storm intensified outside, rain striking the roof with increasing force. Richard lit both lanterns and placed one near the stove, the other on the table. The flames offered a warm, steady glow that softened the edges of the room. "Sit with me," he said after settling into the chair opposite hers. His tone wasn't commanding, just inviting. She sat again, folding her hands together. The room felt smaller with the storm pressing in from every side, yet it didn't feel threatening. She found herself studying Richard's hands, the scars across his knuckles, the way he rested his fingers lightly against the table rather than clenching them. He carried history in every detail, but he didn't let it leak into his actions. He noticed her watching. "What is it? You don't act like other men I've known." "Good or bad?" he asked. "Different," she said. "I'm still trying to understand why." He shifted in his chair, unsure how to answer. Honesty wasn't something he used lightly. "I've seen what men can turn into when they're given too much control," he said. "I'd rather not be one of them." Mara looked down at her hands, tracing the faint marks on her wrists where old restraints had rubbed her skin raw. She inhaled slowly. Most men never think that far. The storm howled against the roof again, louder this time. Richard glanced toward the window, but didn't move. "Storm will pass," he said. She looked at him, really looked, and realized he wasn't talking about the weather anymore. A long quiet settled between them, not tense or awkward, but weighted with understanding. Richard leaned forward slightly. "If you ever want to talk about what happened before the auction yard, you can. But you don't owe me that." Her breath tightened. The offer wasn't pressure. It wasn't expectation. It was the first time in years she had been given control over her own story. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "That's fine." The lantern flames flickered as a new gust slammed against the cabin. Mara's heartbeat didn't spike this time. Instead, she glanced toward Richard and found a strange comfort in the way he remained unmoved by the noise. She rose to add more wood to the stove. When she did, Richard stepped aside, allowing her to tend the fire without interruption. She noticed he always made room for her. He always stepped back instead of forward. And for a woman who had spent years being cornered, that small detail changed everything. She returned to the table slowly. "Earlier, when I said I wanted to stay here, I meant it. I just didn't know how to say it properly." "You said it fine," Richard replied. "This place could use another presence." "Presence," she repeated quietly. "Not work, not debt, just presence." "Exactly." Mara's chest warmed with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Permission to exist without fear. The storm outside roared on, but inside the cabin, it finally felt like both of them were starting to step out from the shadows of everything that had shaped them. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand declarations. No sudden closeness. No forced revelation. But something changed. For the first time, Mara didn't see herself as a temporary guest. And for the first time, Richard didn't feel alone. The storm eased overnight, leaving the ground damp and the air sharp enough to bite at exposed skin. Morning arrived with a washed-out sky and thin sunlight that struggled to break through the stubborn clouds. Richard stepped onto the porch first, boots pressing into the soft earth, checking for damage. The rail he repaired days before held firm. The barrel stayed secure. Only a few loose branches scattered across the yard hinted at the storm's strength. Mara followed him outside, her steps slow but sure. She wrapped the coat tightly around her torso, the fabric carrying a faint scent of wood smoke from resting near the stove. Her hair was still slightly damp from washing it earlier, and the cold air made the strands cling to her cheeks. She brushed them back, taking in the wide stretch of land beyond the cabin. It struck her how quiet everything felt now. Silence had always been an enemy in her past, an opening for sudden violence or unwanted attention. But here, it felt like a space she could stand in without bracing for the worst. Richard pointed toward the far fence line. "That corner took some wind. Might need checking later." Mara nodded, watching the distant post tilt forward at a slight angle. She didn't know yet how to help with fence repair, but she found herself wanting to learn. The idea surprised her, wanting anything had been foreign for so long. Richard stepped down into the yard, crouching to examine tracks left in the soft ground by the storm. "Coyote wandered close last night," he said, tracing a print with his gloved finger. "Didn't come near the cabin." She studied the print beside him, noting the narrow shape and the distance between steps. Learning small things like this made her feel more connected to the land, less like an outsider dropped into someone else's life. He stood again, brushing dirt from his hands. His shoulders rolled back, loosening after a night of tension. For the first time, She noticed the exhaustion around his eyes had lightened, just slightly, but enough to suggest her presence wasn't adding strain to his life the way she had feared. Inside, the stove still glowed with leftover embers. Mara slipped back in to stir the pot she'd set up earlier. She added more water, checked the seasoning, and adjusted the heat. She had cooked in harsher places than this, but never for someone who expected nothing from her in return. Richard entered a moment later, carrying 2 damp pieces of firewood that had been partly sheltered by the porch. "Storm soaked the pile," he said, placing the pieces near the stove. "We'll need to dry these before tonight." Mara crouched beside the wood and helped him arrange it near the heat. Their hands brushed once as they reached for the same piece, and both paused, not with embarrassment, but with the awareness that the moment mattered in a quiet, unspoken way. Neither pulled back too quickly. Neither explained the hesitation. Richard straightened and wiped his palms on his coat. "You sleep all right?" he asked, voice steady. "Better than I expected," she said truthfully. "Storm noises used to keep me awake. Last night didn't." The admission surprised him. A small shift ran across his expression, something like relief mixed with a deeper acknowledgement he didn't voice. "You're adjusting," he said. "I think so." Mara felt that truth settle into her chest, not as a weight, but as a subtle grounding. She wasn't waiting for footsteps outside the door. She didn't jump at every creak of the wood. Her body was beginning to accept the idea of safety. Richard grabbed a small hammer and motioned toward the porch. "Come with me. I'll show you how to check for weak boards." She followed without hesitation. He knelt beside one of the planks and tapped it lightly. "Hear that?" he asked. She leaned down. "It sounds hollow. Means the wood's thinning. We'll want to replace this before real winter hits." Mara nodded, studying his actions closely. She mimicked the tapping on the next board, comparing the sounds. Richard watched her with quiet approval. Not pride, not patronizing interest, just a steady recognition that she was learning. "You pick things up fast," he said. "No one's ever said that to me." His jaw tightened briefly. Then they weren't paying attention. She took in the words with a stillness that wasn't fear. It was something warmer, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. They moved along the porch together, tapping, listening, and marking which planks needed replacement. Richard explained how moisture warps wood, how cold nights settle into the boards, how winter winds pry at every weak point in a structure. Mara listened intently, absorbing details with the hunger of someone who had never been allowed to take part in the maintenance of her own life. When they finished, Richard rested his hand lightly on the porch railing. "Storm didn't hit as hard as I thought it would," he said. "It felt strong enough," she answered. "Maybe," he said, glancing toward her with a faint shift in his gaze, "but you handled it." She looked at him without lowering her eyes. "I'm trying." He nodded once. "You're doing more than that." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine. Mara inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle in her lungs. She wasn't used to feeling capable. She wasn't used to hearing quiet encouragement. The combination left her standing taller than she had in a long time. When they stepped back inside, Richard hung his coat on the nail beside the door. Mara stirred the pot again, tasting it with a small wooden spoon. She adjusted the seasoning without asking his opinion, trusting herself in a way she hadn't dared until now. "You'll make it through winter here," Richard said as he watched her work. She turned slightly, unsure whether he meant it as reassurance or observation. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because you don't quit," he replied, "even when you don't realize it." Mara held his gaze, and in that quiet exchange something shifted. Not romantic, not dramatic, but foundational. It was the recognition of 2 lives slowly intertwining through small acts, shared routines, and growing steadiness. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted east. Inside the cabin, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. The beginnings of belonging. The next morning brought a calmer sky, clearer than any in the past week. Pale sunlight settled across the fields, giving the land a muted gleam that made the edges of the cabin look sharper and more defined. Richard stepped outside early, checking the soil, feeling the ground firm beneath his boots now that the storm had passed. The air was cold enough to sting his hands, but the clarity of the morning settled something inside him. The cabin looked different to him today, not changed in structure, but changed in meaning. It no longer represented solitude. It represented possibility. Mara appeared in the doorway behind him, her steps measured but confident. She carried the coat more loosely than before, as if it had shifted from being a shield to being simply something warm to wear. Her hair lifted slightly in the breeze as she stepped off the porch. "Morning," she said, her voice no longer hesitant. Richard nodded, his eyes scanning her expression with a quiet familiarity he hadn't expected to develop. "You sleep any better?" he asked. "Better than I ever have," she answered honestly. "I don't wake expecting footsteps anymore." He didn't reply right away, but the relief that crossed his face was unmistakable, subtle as it was. He motioned toward the small rise beyond the yard. "Walk with me." Mara followed him up the incline, her boots pressing into the damp earth. The land spread wide ahead of them, untouched, open, and calm. She had never seen it from this angle before. The view startled her, not because of its beauty, but because it felt like an invitation to something stable. Richard stopped near the top of the hill and rested his hand on the worn fence post. "Winter's coming fast," he said. "This place gets cold, but it holds steady if you keep the work going." She studied him. "You've done it alone all these years." "Mostly," he said, "but it doesn't have to stay that way." Those words struck something deep inside her. She waited, unsure whether she should speak or let the quiet settle. He continued, his tone level but warm. "You've made this place feel different." "I didn't expect that." Mara looked out across the land, her thoughts moving with unusual clarity. She had spent years belonging nowhere, surviving places where she was tolerated but never welcomed. Here, work wasn't punishment. Silence wasn't danger. Presence wasn't a trap. For the first time in her adult life, she had the option to choose a future rather than endure one. "You said I was free to decide," she said. "I've been thinking about that." Richard turned toward her slightly, waiting. She took a slow breath. "I want to stay. Not because I owe you anything. Not because I'm afraid to leave. I want to stay because I finally feel steady here." Richard's eyes lowered for a moment, not in doubt, but in quiet acceptance of the weight of her words. When he lifted them again, they held something softer than she had seen before. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay as someone who belongs, not someone who was bought." Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something close to peace. She stepped closer, standing beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. The breeze shifted, brushing her hair across her cheek. Richard reached up slowly, giving her time to pull back. When she didn't, he gently moved the loose strand behind her ear. His hand dropped away immediately, but the gesture lingered between them. Inside the cabin later, Mara began preparing a small meal while Richard repaired a loose hinge on the door. The ordinary sounds, with scraping, metal clicking, water heating, carried a new comfort. The cabin no longer felt like his home with her inside it. It felt like their shared space, shaped by both of their movements. As they ate, Mara noticed something she hadn't before. Richard looked at her directly now, not with caution, not with guarded formality, but with a steady respect that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't shrink. She met his eyes fully. After the meal, Richard stepped outside to take in the last light of the day. Mara followed, standing on the porch beside him as the sun dipped behind a ridge. The landscape glowed faintly, and the cold brushed their faces gently rather than harshly. "I didn't think life could go this way," Mara said quietly. "I didn't think any of this was possible." Richard folded his arms loosely. "Neither did I." The simplicity of his answer held the depth of everything they had lived through separately. It meant he didn't see her as a burden. It meant he didn't see himself as undeserving of companionship. It meant the world ahead might actually be something they could build together. She stepped closer, not because she had to, because she wanted to. He noticed and shifted slightly toward her. Their shoulders touched, not by accident this time, but by choice. She didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. "Mara," he said, voice low, steady. "You're safe here. As long as you stay, I'll make sure of that." She turned to him, her expression calm and certain. "I believe you." The words came without effort. They didn't tremble. They didn't break. They settled in the air like something earned. Richard reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw. She placed her fingers in his without hesitation. Their hands fit together naturally, warm and steady against the cooling evening. They stood like that as the last light faded. Two people who had lived through years of instability, now finding a place where the ground didn't shift beneath them. The storm was gone. The fear had eased. The choice was made by both of them. When they finally stepped back inside the cabin, they did so not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two lives moving toward a shared future, quiet, certain, and built entirely on mutual trust. Their story ended not with questions, but with belonging.